Your Bibles, if you would, to Hosea chapter 10. Hosea chapter 10, that's where we're going to pick back up. We've been studying the minor prophets, and in specific over the last several weeks, we've been talking about the book of Hosea and the prophecies that he brings primarily to Israel, the 10 northern tribes, but he has some comments here and there about Judah as well in this particular prophecy. Tonight, we'll probably... we may move fast. If we move too fast, you can just go, hey, what about this? And I'll be glad to slow down. But really, chapter 10, chapter 11, chapter 12, chapter 13, the rest of the book, it's just one thing after another of God bringing why it is judging them. Here's the state and condition of the people. Some of it we've already looked at. Some of it we've already examined. It's just a continuation of that basic same challenge. There are some various new phrases, if you will, or thoughts that we want to stop and pause and consider. Again, I'm not in a hurry, but there's not a lot new in the last 4 chapters for us to examine. And so if we move quickly, that'll be all right as well. So we got into chapter 10 a little bit on Sunday. Notice that their condition just gets worse and worse as they describe it. They've gotten to the point, verse 4, they've spoken words, swearing falsely and making a covenant. Thus judgment springeth up as hemlock in the furrows of the field. What's hemlock, by the way? Okay, like they might describe it as poison. It was a bitter plant, if you will, that would come up in amongst that which was good. In other words, it spoils that which is good. It would come up and grow and create challenges and difficulties even within the crops that they were potentially going to sustain them. And so that's kind of the way that this problem and difficulty among them occurred. It just began to continue to grow and to flourish, and that poison, if you will, that bitterness begins to just take root and begins to overwhelm all that was good among them, even the good that they had in terms of the prosperity that God had provided for a period of time until they chose to step away from their relationship with Him in more and more drastic ways as they move forward. And the inhabitants of Samaria shall fear because of the calves of Bethaven, for the people thereof shall mourn over it, and the priests thereof that rejoiced on it, for the glory thereof, because it is departed from it. They had some periods of prosperity, but the problem is who they give credit to that to? Themselves or these idols, the calves, the altars that they had built. And so the prophet tells them, I'm going to bring that situation to mourning. God is going to allow them to appreciate or learn, maybe is a better word, that all that trust and all that confidence that they had been putting in those idols and putting in those worship to all these various gods that they had decided to honor, that's ultimately going to come to an end. You know, you begin to trust and rely upon things in a certain fashion. They begin in their minds to think that it wasn't Jehovah God, it was something else that was prospering them, and all this worship to various gods they had designed themselves to. And so God says that's going to come to an end. I'm going to bring that situation to mourning. No more glory there. You're going to be wondering, why have these gods all forsaken us? It shall be also you carried in unto Assyria for a present to King Cherub. Ephraim shall receive shame, and Israel shall be ashamed of his own counsel. Who's King Cherub, by the way? Or Jerub? That's a trick question. I'm going to tell you that right off the bat, by the way. Well, you find him in the chronology. And he's from Assyria, by the way. And you won't find him in the chronology of the Assyrian kings. And here's what it is. It's actually a use in terms of a definition. Jerub means strife. And so the king of strife. You're going to go into the hands of the king of strife. You won't find in the annals of the king. You're not going to find this as a person. He's talking about the definition of this name and term is what you're going to fall under and the challenges that it brings. And so you be for a present to King you'll be a present to the king of strife, to the strife and challenges and difficulties that the Assyrian leaderships are going to bring against you. Ephraim shall receive shame, and Israel shall be ashamed of his own counsel. Again, you go from feeling pretty confident and feeling like that everything's going your way to now shame and embarrassment for all the failures and difficulties that they had brought. As for Samaria, her king is cut off as the foam upon the water. The high places also of Avon, the sin of Israel, shall be destroyed. The thorn and the thistle shall come upon their altars. They shall say to the mountains, cover us, and to the hills, fall on us. That's how bad it's going to get. The devastation and destruction and difficulties are going to arise in such a way that you're going to look up to the mountain, you're going to say, just fall on me. That would be a better lot, that would be a better circumstance for me than the difficulties and challenges of this army that's coming down and oppressing and bringing difficulties to us. Just let the hill and the mountain fall right down on top of us. We'll be better off in that state than the state or condition you'll find yourself in when the judgment comes. O Israel, thou hast sinned from the days of Gibeah. Think back to Sunday. We talked about Gibeah, right? On Sunday morning, we talked about the violence and the horrible situation that happened there in relationship to the prophet and his concubine and that whole scene that occurred. And I reminded you of that in our study on Sunday. And so he reverts them back to that thinking for a minute. O Israel, thou hast sinned from the days that you should have known better. When God saw this wickedness that happened in Gibeah, and he sends the people and demands that the people go bring judgment against Benjamin and the people of Benjamin because of what they had done there in Gibeah, the point that the prophet's making is you should have understood the power of the judgment of God from that scene. That historical moment should have reminded you, or should have been an education to you, that when you choose to create sinful practices, when you choose to do things that are vile in the eyes of God, then don't be shocked when judgment comes. And when God decides to address those difficulties and challenges that you've brought, rather than recognize and mourn over what happened at Gibeah and recognize that the ultimate power that God has, they walked right down the same path that caused Gibeah to receive that destruction. There they stood. The battle in Gibeah against the children of iniquity did not overtake them. It is in my desire that I should chastise them, and the people shall be gathered against them. They shall bind themselves in their two furrows. Ephraim is a heifer that is taught, and loveth to tread out the corn. But I passed over upon her fair neck. I will make Ephraim to ride. Judah shall plow, and Jacob shall break his clods. Here's what I think he's trying to point out there in verse 11. Were they uneducated about what God would want from them? No. Had he sent prophet and priest and leadership over time that taught and instructed them in the manner in which they should to live and behave themselves? Yes, they were taught how it was that they should be able to function. They loved to do what? To tread out the corn. God said, don't muzzle what? The ox that treads. So here they are. They're in the yoke with God, and they're serving the purposes that or should have been serving the purposes that God had set. God instructed them, taught them, aided them, gave them everything necessary to do exactly what He wanted from them. He even, while they were doing the work, let them eat the corn. That's the imagery here. In fact, that imagery is used again in the New Testament, is it not? Anybody can tell me offhand real quick the example that's used in relationship to you don't muzzle the ox that treads the corn in the New Testament times. I give you that assignment for Sunday. Yeah, I believe so. I think he talks about the eldership and those who serve in that capacity that you should. And we talk about, when we study the eldership, we talk about the fact that God's wisdom there is that churches have the authority to provide for even those who lead in that capacity. That's the imagery of that. It's an Old Testament theme as well, about not muzzling the ox that treads the corn. They're doing the work. They have right in some senses to the benefits of that. So I let you do that. But it's over. The benefits that I gave to you, the help that I offered, it's over. Judgment is on the way. And the only thing that's going to ultimately turn that is the description starting in verse 12. Sow to yourselves in righteousness, reap in mercy, break up your fallow ground, for it is time to seek the Lord, till He come and rain righteousness upon you. You have plowed wickedness, you have reaped iniquity. You have eaten the fruit of lies, because thou didst trust in thy way, in the multitude of thy mighty men. Therefore shall a tumult arise among thy people, and all thy fortresses shall be spoiled, as Shalman spoiled Betharbel in the day of battle. The mother was dashed in pieces upon her children. So shall Bethel do unto you because of your great wickedness. In a morning shall the king of Israel utterly be cut off. And so he uses historical backdrop, he uses imagery, he uses all kinds of language and to try to help them recognize that judgment's coming. And what you should do in the midst of that judgment is turn to righteousness and mercy. It's time to seek the Lord again. And in hopes that He'll do what at the end of verse 12, by the way? That He'll rain righteousness. I want you to think about that for a minute. What might be your initial response to condemnation or judgment or a harsh punishment like God is bringing? What might you do in relationship to God in that moment? Okay, that's the hope, right? The hope would be that repentance would come. That's what the prophet is saying they need. But what else could you do? You could turn away. You could become bitter because of the judgments. You could become angry with God for taking the blessings away and causing this calamity to fall upon us. And so the prophet, in my simple thought, is that he's trying to encourage them in the midst of this judgment. Don't fall prey to the temptation of attacking God over it, creating more difficulties for yourselves because of that. The right reaction to this is to sow righteousness, to seek mercy, to seek the Lord, and pray that ultimately He'll bring righteousness back to the people, because that's the only thing that's going to make them whole again. Righteousness is the only thing that's going to allow them and aid them to become the people that God would desire for them. And so the answer to the condemnation and judgment and punishment and consequence that God is bringing is get back to God and let His righteousness reign, R-A-I-N, in this narrative, back upon them. Thoughts or comments about chapter 10? All right, jump to chapter 11. As he's still discussing why it is the condemnation is coming, what conditions they found themselves in. When Israel was a child, then I loved him and called my son out of Egypt. As they called them, so they went from them. They sacrificed unto Balaam and burned incense to graven images. So, in their infancy, when God brought them out of Egypt, in those early days, God blessed and encouraged them. What thanks did they give Him? They worshipped idols. So God blessed them, and they sacrificed to Balaam. God led them out of bondage, and ultimately they go into idolatry despite that fact. The great warning to me, and maybe one of the kind of the lessons that we can extract from this prophecy coming primarily to Israel through Hosea, is that anyone is susceptible to not honoring God even when He's blessed them. Anybody's susceptible to that. It doesn't mean that I'm going to go build myself an altar somewhere. It doesn't mean that I'm going to go fashion an image of some type. But there are all kinds of ways in which in my own life, where God may be trying to do what He can to bless and help and strengthen me, and yet I don't offer sacrifice unto Him as a result of it. I'm still making my sacrifices for other things and towards other things. God benefits me, but I'll make sacrifices that aren't honoring Him in my life. I taught Ephraim also to go. I taught Ephraim also to go, taking them by their arms, but they knew not that I healed them. It's a pretty sad condition that the people have gotten into. They don't even know when God's helping them, when He isn't. And they certainly aren't honoring Him for the healing and the benefit that He brings to them. I led them. I guided them. I brought them out of bondage. I led them by the arm. When they were injured, when they were hurt, when they needed strength and help, I provided it. I drew them with cords of a man, with bands of love, and I was to them as they that take off the yoke on their jaws, and I laid meat unto them. I held them together as a people with my love. I would take off the yoke from them. I would lighten their burden. I would take food and lay it in front of them. And they still wouldn't honor Him. They still wouldn't respect who God was and what He was doing and the benefits that He was bringing to them. He shall not return into the land of Egypt, but the Assyrian shall be his king, because they refused to return. And the sword shall abide on his cities, and shall consume his branches and devour them, because of their own counsels. That's a phrase that we've seen a couple times now. Because you when you sought counsel among yourselves, your response or reaction to all that was not return to God. The answer to that was, let's find a nation that we can grade covenant with, or let's try to devise some plan, or let's go to Bethaven and bow down to some idols for a while and see if we can find some answers. So this consuming power and judgment of God is coming. And they kept counseling among themselves instead of counseling with who? With Jehovah. And remember the earlier narratives where the prophet talked about the fact that they would listen to the false prophets but won't listen to the honorable men that come and share truth with them about their condition. My people are bent to backsliding from me. Though they called them to the Most High, none at all would exalt Him. When you think about the idea of backsliding, you think about that. When you're actually sliding, do you have much control? And think about that imagery just for a minute. So generally speaking, when you slide, I know for some of you this is going to be really hard to go back this far, but remember when you used to go to a park, right? You'd climb up the ladder and you get on the top of the slide. And once you let gravity take over, you're gone, right? You're out of it. You're at the mercy of the situation. Here's what I want us to think about with the idea of backsliding. Once you start that trend, it's awful hard. Now, is it possible to stop? Sure. Have you ever been going down a slide and too fast and scary for you? And what do? You stick those rubber soles of your feet down on the slide and you try to stop, right? Yeah. But it's a lot harder going backwards too, right? Well, I'm not worried about blister, Tom. The analogy isn't quite that deep. But anyway, you get the picture that I'm trying to draw here for you. You get to sliding backwards, and it's hard to stop. It's hard to end a backwards slide. That's why the New Testament, Jesus says, you do what? You go forward. He who puts his hand to the plow and looking backwards is not fit for the kingdom, Jesus said. You can't go backwards. And once you start the trend of sliding backwards, then the problem is that trend is hard to break. It's yeah. And the truth is, the more we slide, the faster we slide away from God. That's what they were. My people are bent to, and they were actually, it's kind of what they wanted. They were determined to slide further and further away from Jehovah. And they were making a decision. Though they called them to the Most High, none at all would exalt. Can you imagine coming? You're really a backsliding nation. You're getting further and further away from God at every turn. But then you'd show up once in a while on a feast day and say, "Here we are, Lord. We've come not to exalt you above our other gods. We've come to honor you like we do all the other gods. We've come to offer you a token." They would not exalt Him as God, as the Most High. And that seems to be, in some ways, one of the reasons that he describes here that has brought about his condemnation and judgment against them. And what a sad condition. Not only are they sliding away from Him further and further, but even when they come before Him and they've been called to assemble before Him, they won't exalt Him. They won't elevate Him. Go ahead, Raymond. I'll come back to you. Yeah. 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 And I think maybe some of that falls in that verse 6 when he said, because of their own counsels. We listen to ourselves rather than God. And that'll take us backwards every time. Yeah. And we create greater difficulties. And the further you go, the harder it is to find and seek the Lord again. And that's the danger of some of that difficulty. Yeah. Yeah. I decided one time when I was about, I suppose 9 or 10 years old, we had a big patch of low spot in the yard where water would lay, and then it froze over. And I decided it'd be fun to take my bike at about 100 miles an hour and hit the brakes on that ice. It was a lot of fun the first 4 times. 5th time wasn't fun when that finally kicked out from underneath. And we can become comfortable with backsliding, but eventually the hit comes. And here's the sad part. They're going to backslide to such a point and such a degree in the picture that they're going to get disconnected from God and won't bother. They're going to seek allegiances with other places. They're not going to immediately return back to Him and seek after Him. It's really sad that they had gotten so far away that they can't even find Him. Yeah, and people easily get comfortable sometimes the further away they get.
We think we can stop on our own. That's when we need help.
Yeah. And I think that's true, Jim. I think that sometimes that in the midst of the backslide, there's probably all kinds of hands reaching out to us. The prophet's hands were reaching out to the people, not just Hosea, but those prior to Hosea, reaching out to the people, trying to get them to come back towards the Lord. They just wouldn't take their hand. And I think you're right. If we'll recognize sometimes there's assistance and help all around us, reaching out, trying to get us to stop this backward trend. Yeah. It's a matter of what we want to do sometimes. How shall I give thee up, Ephraim? How shall I deliver thee, Israel? How shall I make thee as Admah? How shall I set thee as Zebulun? Mine heart is turned within me. My repentings are kindled together. I will not execute the fierceness of mine anger. I will not return to destroy Ephraim, for I am God and not man, the Holy One in the midst of thee. and I will not enter into the city. What's the picture that the prophet seems to be drawing about God's judgment here? Okay. And so though he's completely capable, I will not execute the fierceness of mine anger. Yeah. You deserve far worse than what's going to happen. It's going to be horrible. You're going to wish the mountains would fall on you. It's going to be so bad. But then the Lord says, but it's not even going to be out of the full fierceness of my anger. I don't know how often we've seen the full fierceness of the anger of God. Yeah. Yeah, and that different picture, but yeah, similar circumstances. Maybe in the days of Noah, we see a heightened level of just God's utter anger and frustration with man, that He would only allow 8 souls to be saved in that situation, but still a remnant, but such a small remnant when you think about. But here's what I love about, in some senses, about what he says. So here comes the judgment, and it's not like I'm going to come in and cause the problem and just keep coming in and if I see a couple left, I'm going to come in and take care of them. If I see a few there, I'm going to come in and take care of them. And the reason he said is that, for I am God and not what? We need to wake up every day and praise the name of Jehovah that statement is true. For I am God, not man. If God treated man like man treats man, I don't think any of us would want that. Yeah, exactly. There is a beauty in understanding the difference between God and man. I don't know if I ever preached a series. It's not a series. It's a couple of lessons that I basically call them "Let God be God and let people be people." And anyway, and shake your head this way, I'll preach that Sunday. I haven't picked anything yet, but anyway, but we've got to do that. We've got to let God be who He is, because He's holier than us. His ability to control His righteous indignation. That they deserve this punishment. They deserve the condemnation that He brings for the transgressions and the behaviors and the sinful practices among them. I mean, He compares them to Gibeah. I mean, just think about that. He compares them to that scene there that we talked about on Sunday. And yet He says, I'm the Holy One in the midst of thee. I'm not like man. I wouldn't don't react in the same ways that man would.
United Nations, they make treaties all the time. They constantly break covenants with each other. God never breaks a covenant.
Yeah. And in His frustration and anger in this sense is because they were attempting to break the covenant that He was going to continue to honor. And we should have a healthy respect for that as well. Good. Well, yeah. Poor choice of words. Go ahead, Mary. Yeah. Yeah. Right. And the only difference, Mary, is that the United States of America is not in covenant relationship with God as Israel was. We look at ourselves sometimes as if we are, but we don't. I'm not saying God hasn't blessed this country. I'm not saying that we ought to think long and hard about where those blessings come from and where that prosperity come from and who we ought to honor for that. But you're right. You do wonder what would He say? not about adulterating a covenant, because that doesn't exist in the same fashion that it did with his people in those days. But we do have accountability for the way we behave and the way we act and the righteousness that we either embrace or ignore. And you do wonder sometimes, what does He really think of us when He looks down and sees wickedness seemingly increasing on a regular basis? And He doesn't have to bless us any more than He had to continue to bless them, even when they were breaking the covenant relationship they had with Him. Yeah, and I think that's right. And that's the distinction, I think, even from the time of Jesus on. The distinction is there is no blood nation anymore. There is no fleshly nation anymore. It's one. All nations are called into one blood, which is Jesus Christ. And all of us now have the same obligation and accountability to live under the standard of righteousness that God prescribes. And His principle of righteousness exalts a nation doesn't go away, even though there's not a particular bond of heritage. Righteousness will always exalt nations. And sin will always be a reproach to any people. It doesn't matter which side of the testaments you happen to live on. Well, and sadly, that may be the case. I saw the other day an interesting statement that I've thought about before, but I've never necessarily expressed. But you wonder sometimes why people seem to be so up in arms about something they don't believe exists. Doesn't make much sense when you think about it. Why? I mean, lots of other things you can be getting upset about than somebody believing something you say is a myth. Then why are you upset? Think I'm crazy maybe, but why get so angry and hateful over something you don't even believe is real? Yep. Yeah. And let me and I'm cautious sometimes, but let me just say this: the truth is, we don't know that He hasn't already stepped in. We won't always know sometimes in what manners God is working among the nations and people, and our job then is to be light and salt. Jesus says, "Be the light of the world, be the salt of the earth," and that's the accountability we have. And be prayerful that there'll be enough of us doing that God will still want to bless the whole for the remnant that's still striving to honor Him and serve Him. Thoughts or comments? I'll let you chase that rabbit if you want to. All right. They shall walk after the Lord. He shall roar like a lion. When He shall roar, then the children shall tremble from the west. They shall tremble as a bird out of Egypt, and as a dove out of the land of Assyria. And I will place them in their houses, saith the Lord. Ephraim compasseth me about with lies, the house of Israel with deceit. But Judah yet ruleth with God, and is faithful with the saints. And so, I'm going to come in like a lion. I'm going to come in swiftly. They shall tremble as a bird out of Egypt, and as a dove out of the land of Assyria. That when they see the difficulties and the challenges that I'm going to bring, but then He throws this little piece of information at the end that at this moment, under which king? We've said him several times in our study. And Judah? These are the days of Hezekiah, right? These are the days of Hezekiah, one of the good kings. And so in the moment, though, sporadically throughout the prophecy, he's made comments about how Judah eventually will face some condemnation themselves. But in this moment, Ephraim is compassing about with lies, the house of Israel is with deceit, but Judah is striving in this moment to try to honor God through some quality leadership that they don't have all the time. And here's interesting, and it's just a note, by the way, you don't see that word very often in the Old Testament, do you? It's not a. We see that as a word more common in New Testament descriptions, but it's interesting that word is used here. And I realize you get translation issues sometimes, but that word is used in relationship to Old Testament folks, to the southern kingdom of Judah, to the faithful with the saints there in that occasion. And I just found that, I don't know what that means. I don't know if it means anything necessarily in great, something profound. I just found it interesting that here's a word that we generally ascribe to folks who are followers of Jesus in New Testament times, but it's used prior to that. It's used in relationship to Judah here. And so the word's very generic at times. It's simply meaning those who follow and serve and honor Jehovah. Yeah. Go ahead, Brian. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Yeah. Chapter 12. So Ephraim feedeth on wind. How nutritious is wind? All right. Feed on air. And followeth after the east wind. He daily increaseth lies and desolation, and they do make a covenant with the Assyrians, and oil was carried into Egypt. And so their response in some senses to the prophecies concerning the judgment that is to come is not return to God, not rebuild this relationship with Jehovah like they should. Their answer is, we better make some covenant with these other nations. We better make some treaties and alliances with these other nations. And it's interesting that they make the alliance with one of the places that's going to be the ones who's coming down and bring the judgment against them when Assyria finally gets involved. But we're going to try to make that covenant. We're going to send some financial benefits down towards Egypt, see if we can't help ourselves in that relationship. The Lord hath also a controversy with Judah, and will punish Jacob according to his ways, according to his doings will he recompense him. So boy, it didn't take the prophet long, did it? 2 breaths ago, he just said there's some saints still in Judah, there's still some leadership that's positive there in that moment when the prophet is speaking. But he also says there's controversy coming for them as well. And punishment and challenges that's coming. He took his brother and he goes back. Who's he talking about here? In verse 3. Right, talking about Jacob and Esau in this picture. If you recall the history of Jacob and Esau, which is older by a moment. Esau's the older, right? But there's from the moment they were born, and it's a hard concept to even think about. But what's he doing when they're born? He's holding on to his heel. You're not going first alone is the imagery from the start, and then that whole history of difficulty and challenge and trying to supplant Esau and his birthright. And so he took his brother by the heel in the womb, and by his strength he had power with God. Yea, he had power over the angel and prevailed. He wept and made supplication unto him, and he found him in Bethel, and there he spoke with us. I believe if you... Oh, my brain's going to freeze for a second. Genesis 30... I want to say 2, but it's probably 36. But there's a moment when Jacob Esau's being pursued. Was I right first? 32. It is 32. Okay. So in Genesis 32, Esau's pursuing Jacob. Jacob sends his family across the river, and he spends the night there by himself, and he wrestles with God there in the mud of the Jabbok River in Genesis chapter 32. And it's interesting because notice he said that, and by his strength he had power not over God, with God. If you recall, if you go back and read that scene there in chapter 32 of Genesis, they wrestled practically all night. And neither necessarily gained an advantage over the other. Now, add verse 4. That's a great text, by the way, because it helps us kind of understand how it is that Jacob was able to wrestle with God, because it doesn't really say that, I don't think, in the Genesis 32 account, but verse 4 tells us that he had power over the angel. Okay, so here's these depictions: power with God, power over the angel, and prevailed. And he wept and made supplication unto him, and found him in Bethel, and there he spoke with us. So Jacob wrestles with God, challenged with this situation. What's God do to him once they've done wrestling, by the way? Yeah, basically, and then they were not to eat from the sinew of the hip from that point forward. Jacob walked with a limp for the rest of his life. And then what else happens in that moment, by the way? Change his name. That's when his name gets changed to Israel. So he's just pointing them back to the beginnings of their history, and reminding them of segments of that history in hopes that it might spur some kind of thought on their mind, as well as why these difficulties and judgments are coming. Even the Lord God of hosts, the Lord is his memorial. You should be remembering these things. These things should be a memorial to you. Therefore turn thou to thy God. Keep mercy and judgment, and wait on thy God continually. He is a merchant, and balances of deceit are in his hand. He loveth to oppress. And Ephraim said, Yet I am become rich. I have found me out substance. In all my labors they shall find none iniquity in me that were sin. Think about what he's saying. So God says, from the time I turned Jacob into Israel, from the time that this struggle in the Jabbok River occurs, they began to wrestle with God and whether or not they would honor him or dishonor him from really that point forward in the picture that he's drawing. And I'm asking you to turn to God, but you won't. Deceit's still in your hand. You still love to oppress others. You say, I've become what? I've become rich. I've found me out substance. I'm doing just what? I'm just doing fine. I'm doing just fine. There's no reason for me to be concerned about it. I'm doing just fine in all my labors. They shall find none iniquity in me that were sin. Think about that. How prideful is that? You won't find any sin. Really? They're willing to try to take that stance, that there's no sin within them. Yeah. When you get to make your own standard, I suppose you won't sin. When you get to decide, when you convince yourself that you get to decide what's sinful and what's not sinful, then it's pretty easy not to sin. You just take the things you want to do off the list of things that are sinful. And I that am the Lord thy God from the land of Egypt will yet make thee to dwell in tabernacles as in the days of the solemn feast. They're going to become sojourners and pilgrims in strange lands when the Assyrians come down and take them over. If you recall, we talked about this before, but when the Assyrians would come and take over different nations, they wouldn't necessarily just destroy them all, but they would disperse them. They'd take these people and say, okay, you don't live in your homeland anymore. You live over here now. And he'd take them over there and make them live in tents. And here's another pocket of a nation that they overcame and say, well, you're going to go over here and live. And they would disperse them and make them uncomfortable in order to keep them subdued. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah. And all of that because of this situation that they had created. So you're going to continue to dwell, or you're going to go back to dwelling, maybe I should say, in tents and tabernacles, just like those days when all this got started, the 40 years waiting to take over the promised land. I've also spoken by the prophets, and I have multiplied visions and used similitudes by the ministry of the prophets. I've multiplied the vision. So you think about it. Maybe they don't want to listen because it's only one message from one prophet. So let me give them more prophets, and let me throw more visions at those prophets, so that there'll be a preponderance of evidence, if you will. There'll be an overwhelming amount of information and knowledge revealed to them. Surely they'll embrace it if it comes one after another, prophet after prophet, vision after vision. And if that's not enough, I'll use similitudes. What's that word mean, by the way? Yes. So similar things. So I'll give them comparisons. We call those what? What did Jesus use in the New Testament? Parables. Okay? Jesus used what are defined in the New Testament as parables. I believe that's a similitude of the similitudes here in the Old Testament, where he's talking about I'm going to draw you pictures. I'm going to give you things to compare. Everything I can by these ministering prophets. Is there iniquity in Gilead? Surely they are vanity. They sacrifice bullocks in Gilgal. Yea, their altars are as heaps in the furrows of the fields. And Jacob fled into the country of Syria, and Israel served for a wife. And for a wife he kept sheep. And by a prophet the Lord brought Israel out of Egypt, and by a prophet was he preserved. Ephraim provoked him to anger most bitterly. Therefore shall he leave his blood upon him, and his reproach shall his Lord return unto him. We never want to exclude the influence and power that God is using to bring this judgment. But don't forget that, for lack of a better description at the end of our study here, the natural course of problems that they're creating for themselves in the manner in which they're dealing with the Assyrians and the Egyptians and others. Quick fast forward, just in your mind real quick. Remember the prophecies in relationship to Judah in particular. And those kings over Judah, that God kept telling them by prophets like Jeremiah, kept saying, don't resist and you'll be okay. And what they do? They resisted anyway. They don't resist us with the Assyrians when they come. Don't take them on. Don't fight with them. Don't just submit yourselves to them, and this thing will be a lot easier on you. But they sometimes create their own problems, and I don't think Israel's an exception to that. I think some of the difficulties and judgments that come, though God is there and involved and desires for them to reap. But notice that word. Ephraim provoked him to anger most bitterly, therefore shall he leave his blood upon him. The consequences of his own choosings and decisions and choices that he made brought this reproach and condemnation. It wasn't just God arbitrarily sending consequence. They brought this on themselves in the way they were dealing with others. All right. Thought we might. Didn't quite get there. So we'll finish it up and then move forward in our study of the minor prophets on Sunday.